morning, everyone. I hope that the audio is coming in clearly. I'm sure someone from IT will send me a message or not. If not, thank you to the Freemind Group for having me present this morning. Sorry I can't be there in person. As was said, I was planning to come out, but a virus had other plans for me. And unfortunately, I was in no shape to fly out to San Francisco yesterday. But this will have to do. It's good to be here virtually. My name's Joe Buccina. I'm the Policy and Research Director at the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, or NSCEB. In my past life, I worked at a couple startups. I also spent 6 years at InQtel, which is a strategic investor for the U.S. national security community. So in a different year, I might have been with you in the audience, scouting out funding opportunities for a startup. But now I'm in my first government role at the commission. So let me tell you a little bit about it. All right. So we're a legislative advisory body. Our statutory language is on the slide, but basically, we develop policy ideas at the intersection of national security and emerging biotechnology. Now, this is something that the U.S. government does every few years for a hard tech problem. So we had one recently for artificial intelligence. There was also a commission for cybersecurity, and now it's biotech's turn. One thing I did want to note is one of our major focus areas is non-pharma biotechnology. So think bioindustrials, agricultural biotech. We're probably more focused on that dimension of biotech than many presentations you'll hear throughout JPM week. I just wanted to mention that if you hear that sort of tilt or slant in my presentation, so you know where we're coming from. All right, so we're led by a group of 11 commissioners. Think of them as sort of like our board of directors. And then we have a team of 25 full-time staff, of which I'm a member. I lead the policy and research team. Now, one of our superpowers that I always like to mention is we have 4 sitting members of Congress as commissioners. You can see them up here, including our chair, Senator Todd Young from Indiana. That's actually the first time a commission has been set up this way. I think it'll really help us to get some of our ideas passed into law. And you'll also note that we are both bipartisan, even split between Democrats and Republicans, and bicameral, even split between the House and the Senate. And I think that's been very nice as we are just about to start a switch from one party in power to another. Being bipartisan, this isn't something that we're at all concerned about. All right, and this slide here, it shows our commission's lifespan. So we started work in spring of 2023. We published our interim report in December of 2023. That was mostly stage setting for what we plan to focus on for our final report. And we have been hard at work on that final report. So you'll see right here the kind of "you are here" dot there. That's where we are. We're pretty close to spring 2025 when we'll publish the final report. With that timeline, I have to do a bit of a dance today in terms of what I can share because I don't want to scoop our final report. But the final will be a lot different from the interim. It will have the full list of our recommendations at that intersection of emerging biotech and national security. So this will really be, I think, an actionable document for government to, knock on wood here, go take and turn much of our recommendations into law. Now, another unique feature about our commission versus past commissions, you'll see after that final report, there's still a whole lot of timeline left. We go towards the end of 2026. That's when our commission sunsets. And we'll really be focusing on implementing our recommendations during that time. So it's a nice thing being a legislative branch body that we can go to our other colleagues in the legislative branch, namely Congress, and basically advocate for our recommendations. All right, I'm going to get a little bit more into the meat of biotech with the rest of our presentation. One of the things I was thinking about in advance of the talk today is what are some challenges for the biotech industry over, say, the next decade? I think one of the great things about being part of the commission, if you remember that timeline slide, we had our first year or so as sort of a get smart phase on the biotech industry. We engaged with a range of experts. We read everything we could get our hands on. And so here's my sense of some of the big challenges. By no means an exhaustive list. You'll have to see a report for that. But these are some that I thought it would be interesting to talk through today. So I see challenges in a few different fields. First, on the regulatory side, the regulatory pathway, simply put, needs to be simplified. And I think this is especially true for non-pharma biotechnology. And there are a few key challenges that I'll mention today. First, uncertainty about which agencies are responsible for regulating your products. Again, this is maybe more for the non-pharma biotech, but it is a big issue. Second, overlapping processes across multiple agencies. Third, unnecessary regulatory burdens for products that have already been deemed safe. And then finally, I think that process limited capacity is leading to delays. This seems to be a universal problem. Second, on the financial side, I'll mention a few things. The macro picture. Now, this may not hold for the full decade, but I think it's certainly it's been a challenge now, and I think it will be for at least some period of time. Interest rates are higher. Private sector investors are not willing to take on as much risk. This just means that the money that was flowing more easily prior to interest rates going up is not doing so right now. Second, scale up infrastructure funding. There's early stage VC and non-dilutive funding available. I think that's part of why you're here today. And I think there's later stage commercial funding that's pretty readily available once a product is proven. But there's this gap in the middle to fund scale up infrastructure. And we don't have sort of a common use infrastructure facility, like, for instance, the BioBase Europe pilot plant in Belgium. So funding, I think, is a really important part of that equation as you're getting past the early stages and maybe trying to cross that valley of death that we just talked about and that we'll get into a little bit later. Third, this is not, a funding problem per se, but I think worth noting that emerging biotech often lacks confident early customers. There is some technical risk and business risk associated with many biomanufactured products, especially when they're competing against incumbents who use proven traditional manufacturing methods. So this can be an impediment on the emerging biotech side. Third, getting into data. I think data has always been important for biotech, but it's becoming even more so with this growing convergence of AI and biotechnology. Unlike some other countries, the U.S. doesn't really have a data strategy, and they don't have we don't have a mechanism for prioritizing high quality data collection. I think that's a challenge for any part of the industry that relies on kind of commonly held or public use data sets. Last, workforce. I see this broken down into two major challenges. First, getting enough skilled workers. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about PhDs. We need people to do things like, manage biomanufacturing plants as well. There's a domestic component there, of course. I think that largely focuses on education and training. But there's certainly an international component as well. And for me, that really breaks down to attracting and retaining some of the best and brightest from around the world. And last, I'll mention something that you may not have thought of before, this idea of bioliteracy. And I think that we have a bioliteracy challenge for the US government. By that, I just mean enough proficiency in biology, biotechnology, so that you can make informed decisions. Because after all, if the people making policies for the biotech industry aren't bioliterate, then I think we're all in big trouble. So I mentioned before that, I can't steal our thunder for the final report, but, we wouldn't be much of a commission if we hadn't thought about some ideas for how to address the challenges I just mentioned. So rather than get into specific recommendations, let me tell you about the focus areas we've been working on, which will be reflected in the recommendations you'll see this spring. First, strategic finance and investment. This includes a lot of the topics that will be covered today in terms of non-dilutive funding, also venture funding, other strategic investment, loans, some of the market demand challenges I mentioned earlier. That's all tackled in this focus area. Infrastructure, that really runs the gamut from, say, the earliest stage infrastructure you need through commercial scale production capabilities. But I'll note that scale up infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, I think is a particular challenge for the industry. And it falls right in that valley of death. So no coincidence there. Third, bio-ready U.S. government. This is sort of our catch-all for anything that doesn't fit elsewhere and for structural changes to the U.S. government that we think we need to optimize government policies, again, at that intersection of biotech and national security. People and partnerships, that talks about, that focuses on some of the workforce challenges that I mentioned earlier. It also includes things like bioliteracy, which I mentioned, public-private partnerships, which I'll get into in a little more detail later. That's all covered in the people and partnerships group. Regulations, this is mostly non-pharma biotech regulations, but there is a whole lot of ground that we've been covering there that I think could be helpful for the industry. Data, we talked a little bit about it, but I'll just note that data includes both promote measures, coming up with a good data strategy, having a data collection mechanism, and also protect measures. I think there are a lot of biological data. I mean, you may be surprised at some of the protections or lack thereof for biological data that, if you thought about it, might seem pretty private and something that you want to keep relatively secure. The last group, promoting norms, responsibilities, and security. It's a little bit of a catch-all. To give you some tangible examples, this would include things like biosurveillance or DNA synthesis security or modifications to the dual-use research paradigm that the U.S. has had. This all falls into that bucket there. And again, while I can't scoop the final report, we have been fortunate to have 4 recommendations signed into law as part of the fiscal year 25 legislative process, including the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So I can talk to you about some of these early policy adoptions. First, the DoD is going to publish an annual biotechnology roadmap. It's going to assess barriers to the adoption of biotechnology in DoD, DoD workforce needs, and opportunities for international collaboration. Second, the DoD is going to initiate a public-private sandbox in which DoD and industry can securely develop use cases for that intersection of AI and biotech. These last 2 are for the intelligence community. The first is a rapid assessment of biotech in the People's Republic of China and their actions to gain superiority in this sector. And then last, to develop an intelligence strategy to identify and assess biotech threats, especially regarding supply chain vulnerabilities. So again, these are a few of the sort of early adoptions that we've had, but hopefully lots more to come. All right, so I want to talk about, I think, another area of interest for those of you there today, public-private partnerships. This is a first of a few topics kind of in the biospace that are heavy focus areas for us that I just want to delve into and give you a taste of some of our thinking. First, I'll just say this is a really important topic. We dedicated a whole work stream of our efforts to partnerships, and including public-private partnerships. I've got a few logos here as touch points for, I think, good examples of ones that we've seen in government in recent years. First, Operation Warp Speed. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I think it was one of the premier public-private partnerships. You had government taking a portfolio approach and then de-risking vaccine development process for each of its performers, really wildly successful. And then I think, generally speaking, there are a few areas where this public-private partnership model works particularly well for biotechnology. First, just R&D partnerships in general. The U.S. does this really well in terms of providing a lot of funding for early stage R&D, which is then at some point transitioned to industry, where they continue with later stage development. And you see this a lot with NIH funding, for instance. Also want to mention government de-risking innovation for more specific projects. I think the ARPAs do this really well. DARPA, ARPA-H, DARPA BTO, certainly in the biotech space. I know that Mike's presenting and he'll be coming up next. All great examples of this. Also, for R&D or early, where the work is kind of being done in the public interest, but is maybe not getting enough funding from the private sector. I think the BARDA Ventures and GHIC, Global Health Investment Corporation partnership, is a really great example of this. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically BARDA is funding GHIC to act as a strategic investor, like a venture investor, to invest in tech startups focused on health security and public health. It's only a few years old, but I think it's been a great effort so far. Another kind of PPP model that's seen some success is the model of the hub. Creating hubs that combine private sector, the academic world, and the public sector in a joint effort towards a common goal. Skipping over DIU for a second, NSF, I think, does a nice job of this. The TIP, Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate, pretty new, established in 2022, doing some great things there. They have one initiative called NSF Engines, where they're creating regional ecosystems for innovation that bring, again, academic world, industry, government, nonprofits all together. There's quite a few of these across the country now, but just to give you one, out there in California, it's centered in UC Merced, and it focuses on advancing circular bioeconomy technologies. DoD, I think, is also pretty big into public-private partnerships in a few of its components. So DARPA, we mentioned, that's a good one. But also DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, they partner pretty effectively with companies in the private sector of all sizes, small and large, to do rapid contracting, which is always a challenge in government to do contracting at any sort of speed, and then prototyping. So these are a few that I wanted to highlight that if you're not familiar with and you think might be a fit or maybe worth looking into. Next, the Valley of Death. It's made a few cameos already, and we're only on the second presentation of the day. I bet most of you have heard of it. Maybe a few of you have even been stuck in it. But this is basically the gap between R&D and commercialization of biotechnology that can be a real challenge to overcome. We're looking at recommendations that tackle a few relevant areas, and I'll highlight kind of three of those considerations today. First, ways that we can support scale-up infrastructure. So we already talked about that. And again, I think it is a real challenging gap in the industry today. Second, and I think related, is addressing the funding gap during this phase, which I talked about a little earlier. It tends to be toughest in the middle there. Early stage funding and later stage funding and revenue are a little bit easier parts of the equation. And then finally, this idea of just simplifying the regulatory process. I think that will reduce approval timelines, which may draw in hesitant investors, and then should also reduce the time to commercialization and revenue. All right, so government funding for industry-oriented R&D. This is an area where we do focus a lot of energy, kind of filling in funding gaps that the private sector isn't addressing for the most part. We don't want to be redundant with areas where the private sector or commercial markets are doing just fine. So let me go over two examples here. First, biotech with a public sector use case. For example, something the Defense Department would use. That often does not appear as lucrative to private investors. I think that's starting to change a little bit. Defense tech VCs have seen more and more traction, but that's still a challenge. And so I think this is an area where it's worth the government focusing some resources because, again, it's in the public interest for a lot of this tech to have a fighting chance at being successful. And second, platform technologies. So I'd say, generally speaking, early stage biotech platform companies take a bit longer to generate returns than companies that are focused on developing a clinical asset. So to take a concrete example, I think you really need a place like Flagship Pioneering to create and incubate a company like Moderna. We all know Moderna now because they produced mRNA vaccines when the pandemic hit, but you probably had not heard of them before the pandemic. That was an area where it took, I think, a lot of patience, a lot of early stage funding when those returns were not in clear sight. Flagship Pioneering could do that just because of the incubator model they have, but a lot of commercial VCs don't follow that sort of model, and they won't take a bet on a company that takes longer to create returns. And again, I think it's in the public's interest for government to assist with funding there. And I think when you're figuring out concrete ways to support companies and researchers to fill in this gap, I think it'll take a three-part strategy at least. And so I'll go over that here. First, early stage R&D funding to include both dilutive and non-dilutive funding. Second, infrastructure financing, particularly, again, for scale-up infrastructure. And then third, thinking of ways to smooth out market demand for emerging biotech. This isn't strictly R&D, but I do think it helps to de-risk for investors and to get companies revenue sooner. And that brings me to our last slide. So I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity. Wish I could have been there in person with you all, but glad we got to connect virtually at the very least. I've provided some contact info if you want to reach out to me. There's my email, or the commission more generally. We have the ideas box. I've also included our website where you can find our interim report, a bunch of white papers that I think are pretty interesting and worth the read. Our LinkedIn info is there. I think I'm at about time. I'll defer to the FreeMind group there if there's time or even IT ability, we'll say, for questions. I'm glad to do it. Otherwise, feel free to reach out. And thanks very much.